Hi, I'm Neighbor Doran.
I'm Cassandra Barrett.
I'm Rachel Young.
And I'm Tyler Miller.
This is our presentation about South Korean students and their culture and education background. It was a really impactful experience for all of us, being students who don't come from an educational background. We're not education majors, so this was a really eye-opening experience for all of us to look at South Korean students and their experiences and their culture and how teachers can best accommodate them and their needs in the classroom. We learned a lot through the presentation, and we hope you do too.
So first we're going to talk about the longitudinal patterns of settlement for South Korean culture. So South Korea is widely known for its population density. In fact, it is roughly 10 times the global average of 151.96 people per square mile at 1,362 people per square mile. However, South Korea wasn't always known for its population density. The population grew rapidly after it was established as the Republic of Korea in 1948. Even before this year, the Koreans suffered brutal repression at the hands of Japanese. The Japanese tried to wipe out their cultural identity and their language. However, after it established itself as the Republic of Korea and broke from the Japanese, the number of people in South Korea doubled in size from 1948 to 1985. Under the government of Park Chung-hee, he called for urbanization, later marriages, higher education levels, better health programs, and a nationwide family planning program that lowered the population growth rate because there was a need for more growth in the economy, and people started using more protection and started planning their families out. And this government led to a period of industrial development, economic growth in the 1960s and 1970s. This booming economy caused a migration to urban areas. So the urban areas experienced rapid growth as farmers migrated to city factory jobs instead. And South Korea quickly became one of Asia's largest economies and one of the world's 15 largest economies. And not only was the need for urbanization the reason why the population grew, the Korean War also accounted for this rapid increase in urban population because mostly refugees from North Korea poured into the cities to live there. So this is going to be a continuation of the patterns of settlements for South Koreans. I provided a picture on the slide that shows you how South Korea looks. As you can see, South Korea is covered mostly by mountains. So for that reason, you can account for a lot of its population in cities because not many people live in the mountains. In fact, even the capital of Seoul is home to about 50% of the country's population. And although interestingly enough, it seems like the South Korean population is booming. They did have the lowest birth rate in the world in 2009, and the birth rate still remains relatively low today. It has improved, but it's interesting to understand why.
Moving on to the demographics of South Koreans in the United States, it's important to note the Immigration Act of 1965. Post-1965, there was an influx of South Korean immigrants to the United States, given the opportunity to legally come here and naturalize. With naturalization, there was also the opportunity to bring their families over here or settle as citizens and form their own families here in the U.S. I personally know that a lot of other East Asian populations also grew in immigrant population size given the Immigration Act of 1965. This research came from my own independent study into Asian American literature. Now, thinking about the Immigration Act of 1965 as an important piece of literature, we also want to take a brief look into the history of political interaction between the US and Korea. So starting in 1948, Korea became two sovereign states I'm sure you're all familiar with, North Korea and South Korea. This was a result of the Cold War, which was a struggle between the Soviet Union and the US. For the purposes of this presentation, we focus solely on South Koreans, especially given that North Koreans are not legally allowed to leave North Korea and emigrate in other places of the world. That means that it's nearly impossible for us to even have a population of North Koreans here in the first place. There was also the Korean War that went on from 1950 to 1953. With that in mind, and thinking about the political persecution and the war-torn state of their land, it's no question that about 12 to 15 years later, there was an influx of Korean immigrants here in the United States that were trying to escape that environment or find some other new opportunities here. Looking at the graph that I have in this slide, in 1980, we can see that the population size of Korean immigrants is about 289,000. Moving a decade later, that population size has almost doubled to about 568,000. That's an astonishing jump. And we have another jump going into 2000 of about 300,000 more Korean immigrants. And then in 2006, we break 1 million. And consistently from that year, we've had over 1 million Korean immigrants here. So it's no question that the U.S. is home to the largest Korean immigrant population as of 2015. Looking at other statistics, about 52% of Korean immigrants reported to have limited English language proficiency. Later on, we'll talk about the type of education system and the importance on learning English that is within South Korean culture. In addition, 53% of Korean immigrants aged 25 and over have acquired a bachelor's degree or higher as of 2015. I know that 53% may seem a bit low, but thinking in perspective and proportionately to the population of native English speakers that are able to attain a bachelor's degree or higher, this is an astonishingly high percentage of Korean ELLs that are able to maintain that high level of academic achievement. In addition to this, 60% of Korean immigrants 16 years or older were employed in the U.S. labor force as of 2015. Again, this is a high percentage in my opinion. I know that that percentage could be improved, but thinking about how difficult it is for someone with English as a second language to acquire and then maintain a job, especially with racial pressures and pressures to be proficient in English, and then on top of that, if you are proficient, you have an accent, this type of percentage is high and hard to maintain. So the fact that Koreans have been able to keep that, I think, is very impressive. So more than half of Korean immigrants were employed in popular areas such as management, business, sciences, and the arts. In the next few slides, Cassie will talk about the holidays that South Koreans may celebrate and some of the religions that some may identify with.
South Korea celebrates 15 public holidays. Each of these holidays is recognized by the government, and employees have off by law, and all businesses are closed. The first holiday, though, that I wanted to touch on isn't necessarily one of these public holidays that are reserved, but it's the Beijil, and it celebrates the 100th day of a baby's life. So it's a really large celebration for a child on the 100th day of his or her life. There's a ritual prayer that's performed for the baby's health, success in life, and longevity, and babies are actually given gold rings as a gift. I looked through a lot of different pictures that showed this festival for the children, and they're really elaborate. The baby's often dressed in a really adorable garb, or something that's really cultural, really specific to the family, something that means a lot to the family. Really elaborate decorations, cakes, food, all to celebrate the 100th day of life. It shows really the importance not only for health and success and longevity for the children, for the South Korean children, but also a way for families to get together to celebrate the life
and the longevity of their children. The first public holiday that I wanted to talk about is actually regarded as the most important holiday for South Koreans. It's the Lunar New Year's Day. It's also, it's known as Seollal in the Korean culture. They perform the sebe, which is the New Year's bow, which is really important. It's a bow to the ancestors, bow to the elders in the community, and it's celebrated over a 3-day period. The other public holiday that I wanted to mention is Children's Day, which I thought was really unique. Not something that I'd ever experienced in American culture, having a day completely set aside for all the children in America, but they do that in South Korea, reserved for all the children of South Korea. It's celebrated in the first week of May, and it was actually first known as Boys' Day until it was changed to become Children's Day in the 1970s. It really highlights children's need for love and guidance and care in their lives, and it also honors the parents and their contributions to the children's success in life, and honoring the parents for giving children all of the love and attention and providing for their necessities. Every child is celebrated through parties, festivals, museums hold events. There are even parades that happen for children, and the children get dressed up and are just honored all day throughout the day in May. So I thought this was really cool, especially something that would impact the ELLs in our classroom, something that they might like to share and talk about, and really show students who may not be familiar with such a thing as Children's Day. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about religion in South Korea. 44% of South Koreans ascribe to a religion, with Christianity, Buddhism, Confucianism, Islam, and Shamanism topping the list of religions, meaning that South Koreans ascribe to those religions the most. Those are the most followed religions in South Korea. And religious diversity is protected by law, so South Koreans are able to practice the religion that they choose in the manner that they choose without being persecuted or facing any type of discrimination.
So it's really important for educators to be aware of the educational system for their South Korean students and what they're used to from their home. So the South Korean educational system is not too drastically different from that of the United States, but there really are some key differences that educators should be aware of in order to help their students adapt and be able to watch out for any shock that might occur for the students. So the first one is that classrooms are often divided by gender. So boys and girls won't be as integrated in the classroom, and this can mean that curriculum won't be as standardized across gender lines. So that's just one thing to be aware of. The second is that the content is a little bit different. So it's mostly the content sections taught in the classroom are mostly the same as they are in the United States. So they have things like math, they do teach their South Korean language, they have social studies, science, practical arts, fine arts, physical education, all that sort of stuff. But there is one major difference, and that is in moral education. So in South Korea, they actually have moral education built into the curriculum as one of those major content sections. So that really shows how they emphasize conforming to the moral standards of the mainstream society, since it is actually built into what is taught in the classroom. That's not really the case here in the United States. Some teachers might do sort of an informal mentorship of their students. Sometimes there might be discussions surrounding morals and moral characters. There might be the occasional project that touches on this topic, but it's not really built into the major sections of the curriculum in schools. Another thing to be aware of is English and English proficiency. So English is taught in South Korean schools, and it's emphasized early on when they're young, when the students are younger, but it's more of a focus on social conversational English than all the rules of grammar and all that stuff that goes into what many people call correct English. So for this reason, South Korean students will probably have a higher proficiency in their basic interpersonal communication skills than their cognitive academic language proficiency. So that's just really something to be aware of, because as we talked about in class, that's really important to understand how those things are different and be able to identify a student's proficiencies in those. So the last major thing with the educational system in South Korea to be aware of is the daily and weekly schedule. It is quite a bit different than here in the US. So students will usually study before they go to school in the morning, and they'll go to school around 8 o'clock. Classes run for about 50 minutes, which is pretty similar to the United States. And then lunch is usually around noon, and it runs for 50 minutes. And that is significantly different than the United States. It's not too much longer or later, but a lot of times high schools in the United States will have earlier lunches, and they'll be about 20 to 30 minutes. So not having as much time for lunch and having it earlier might be a bit of an adjustment for South Korean students. So then after lunch, classes resume around 1, and they go until 4:30, which is a pretty significant difference than the United States. Because most high schools will let out around 2:30, 3 o'clock. So 4:30 is pretty late compared to the United States. And then after school is over, South Korean students will take a quick break for dinner. Sometimes they will not even go home to do this, and then they'll immediately return to the school to participate in other educational sessions, tutoring sessions, stuff like that, until very late in the night, usually around 10 p.m., which is pretty late for high school age students or younger students or anything like that. So that really shows how much more rigorous and demanding the educational schedule is for South Korean students. They also go to school on Saturdays, so they have a 6-day school week, and that is much different than here in the United States, where there is a lot less time spent in school and a lot less focus on that. So that might be a huge shock for South Korean students. Obviously, it might be an easier adjustment because they'd be going to less school. It would be a little less demanding, but I think that South Korean students would probably not feel as challenged, and that might be a struggle for them. So it's really important for educators to be aware of that and to help their South Korean students feel challenged, positively challenged. The other thing, it could have other effects. I don't think this is very likely, but maybe it goes the opposite way, and a South Korean student takes this newfound, this weight off their chest, this less demanding environment, and might start to slack off a little bit because they think that they can. So it's really all just navigating the situation, and these are all really important things to be aware of as educators so that we can help South Korean students adapt to their new educational environment. Another thing that educators should be aware of in terms of their international students and their ELLs is any sort of legal issues that they might struggle with or that might affect them in any way, both in the United States and in their country of origin. So there aren't really any legal restrictions on immigration from South Korea or any legal issues that target South Koreans specifically, but there have been throughout America's past. So in the 1960s and 70s, and just sort of in the mid-20th century in general, there were a lot of restrictions on immigration from everywhere, but that really affected Asian countries like South Korea, Japan, China, those kinds of places, and that was largely because of the history that was happening during that time. So events like World War II and the Korean War really affected how Americans saw different Asian groups and the stereotypes that were sort of associated with them. So there were a lot of restrictions on immigration from many countries. But these were lifted with the Immigration Act of 1965. So this act sort of lifted a lot of these restrictions on immigrations from all places, especially these Asian places, all these Asian countries. And it made it a little bit easier to immigrate to the United States. So at that time, there was a huge influx in people from Asian countries especially, so South Korea included. There isn't really as much of an influx anymore. That has kind of evened out, but definitely in the 1960s, there was a large increase in immigrants from South Korea. And while this doesn't really affect anyone now, it's really important to be aware of this history as an educator, especially the history of how perceptions towards different Asian groups changed throughout history because of events like those wars. It's especially important to be aware of these when teaching them if you have South Korean students in the class, and just making sure that it's taught in a sensitive way towards them, and it's used as a good opportunity to discuss how these stereotypes and perceptions were problematic, and how we can avoid them as a society in the future. To build off of my previous discussion of legal issues in the United States, it's also really important to be aware of what kind of legal issues affect South Koreans at home, to understand their struggles, their culture, what they're adjusting to, what their experience is like, all that stuff. So there are a couple significant things that I found in my research that educators really should be aware of in order to have a good knowledge of this, and these are at least good starting points. So legal restrictions in South Korea are a bit more restrictive when it comes to things like freedom of expression than they are in the United States. So anything that is considered anti-government or pro-North Korean government, showing North Korean government in a positive light, is criminalized and punished pretty harshly. So any sort of groups that speak out against the government in any kind of way, the government can legally crack down on them and criminalize that behavior. So the culture is really, really strict on anything that can be seen as anti-patriotic, anything anti-government, that sort of stuff. So that's pretty strict. The expression of sexuality is also very restricted in South Korea, particularly homosexuality. There's still many, many stigmas surrounding that. And in my research, I found that the Military Criminal Act was actually passed in the fairly recent history, and this allows some pretty harsh things to be done towards people who are believed to be homosexual. So essentially, the military is under this act is starting a campaign, or has started a campaign, to actively seek out and expose any of their members suspected of homosexual activity, whether these are happening on military bases, anything in military jurisdiction, or outside. If these activities are happening outside of military jurisdiction, they're still able to track these people down and expose them, and then that's also criminalized. So that is really repressed over in South Korea. Women are also still largely stereotyped. So discrimination against unmarried mothers is actually encouraged by the government, and then just women in general are still sort of pushed towards a more caretaker motherly role, and they're kept out of a lot of positions that would give them the power to make decisions and lead both politically and in the business sector. So they're really kept out of that conversation. And these things, we still have a lot of these problems in the United States, a lot of these stigmas and discrimination against women and queer people, LGBTQ people. But it's a lot harsher over in South Korea. So it's really important for educators to understand this, because then they can understand some of the struggles that their South Korean students may have gone through. Also, maybe some of the perceptions that South Koreans have gone to. I mean, a lot of people really, especially when they're going through school, they really take the perceptions of their culture and their family and how they were raised to heart. And if you're raised in this sort of environment where there's so much discrimination towards certain people, then you might start to buy into that yourself. So it's important for educators to be aware of that, so that they can find effective ways to help breed more tolerant students if they have those sort of stigmas. And then again, as I said, it's important to understand that culture, because if they do have LGBTQ plus students, or who are maybe questioning or identifying in those sort of ways, or they do have, female South Korean students, they can understand the kinds of struggles they have faced in their mainstream culture. So it's really important to be aware of all of these things, but it's also really important to not let this lead to any sort of discrimination towards South Korea in general. It's really important to just be sensitive to the students' individual needs by understanding their culture without judgment.
So now we're going to be talking about the cultural interactions that South Koreans are used to. So South Koreans you have the concept of a kiban. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that as best as I can. It sounds like kiban to me. And kiban doesn't have any literal translation into English, but the closest terms that I researched and found was that its terms are like pride, mood, or feelings. And Koreans also believe in the principle of harmony, meaning that they try to be in a peaceful environment and an environment they can thrive in. So they don't want to be in an environment that's stressful. So it's very important that if you're a teacher that you try to avoid hurting someone's kibans, because it hurts their pride and it makes them lose dignity. So an example of a student's kiban being damaged is if the teacher criticizes them in public. This will make them kind of shut down and not want to participate. And another thing that is important for interactions with South Korean students is that their names operate differently than that in Western cultures. So they like to be addressed using their professional titles in the order of family name, called surname, and then second family name, and then finally their given name. So when you address the student, you need to address them in the way that they would like to be addressed. And it is also expected that the higher status is the one that is to initiate conversation and kind of dominate the conversation. So if you come across a student that's very shy and doesn't really seem like they are opening up, it's because in their culture they are used to a person of higher status initiating and dominating conversations. So that's something to look for if you have any South Korean students.
Another really important component that I wanted to talk about was nonverbal communication and behaviors. So nonverbal communication that South Koreans might use in the classroom that may have a different meaning in the American culture. I thought it was really important for future educators to understand how a South Korean student might non-verbally communicate and how teachers can infer and understand what that student is trying to communicate without using words. So the first of these is smiling. Students may smile when they're embarrassed or have made a mistake. So it may not necessarily be that they're happy or they're laughing or, something that might be expected in American culture, but it could mean that they're actually quite embarrassed with themselves and potentially have made a mistake in their work, or smiling is a sign that potentially a student might be embarrassed about something. Pointing. Students do not point with the index finger alone, but rather with their entire hand, something that is not regarded as normal in American culture. So something, again, that teachers would need to be able to recognize in the classroom when they're pointing their entire hand towards something that actually indicates that they're trying to point to something or point to someone. Eye contact. This is a big one. Students will avoid eye contact with teachers to show respect. That may be interpreted to teachers to mean disrespect, that I'm not being looked at, you're not giving me your attention, but in actuality, a student who respects you will not look at you directly in the eyes. Expressions. Students tend to only show facial expression when angry or in disagreement. So if a teacher might expect a different sort of facial expression when they're happy or excited or something like that, or maybe surprised, typically the only facial expressions that are shown by South Korean students would be anger and to convey disagreement. Sneezing. Students may actually excuse themselves from the classroom if they have to sneeze, because sneezing is considered very rude in the culture. So if a student were to just get up out of nowhere and leave the classroom, an initial instinct would be to reprimand the student and tell them it's not okay to leave, but in actuality they're trying to be courteous because they don't want to sneeze and be rude in the classroom, because it's considered very rude in South Korean culture. The next component of nonverbal communication would be physical touch. Students will not initiate physical touch with an elder, but they may reciprocate it. Beckoning. So calling someone toward yourself. Students may wave their hands vertically back and forth, palm facing the ground, to signal come here. So it's very different from the traditional come here or come here that we would experience in American culture. And lastly, bowing. So students may bow to teachers when greeting them. It's a traditional greeting in Korea, and again, another sign of respect.
Like many other ELL populations, Koreans face some difficulties in second language acquisition when it comes to English. For example, phonetic differences between Korean and English can cause a lot of confusion. In Korean, each letter corresponds to a single sound, and these single sounds are called phonemes. Meanwhile, in English, a letter can have multiple pronunciations. As a result, differences in consonant and vowel sounds can cause challenges for Korean ELLs. The root of these language differences comes from English and Korean, each coming from different groups or families of languages. English belongs to the Indo-European language group, meanwhile Korean stems from the Ural-Altaic language family. In addition, differences in stress cause a lot of miscommunications or mispronunciations as well. English is a stress-timed language. Meanwhile, Korean is a syllable-timed language and is not quite as rhythmic as English. For example, Korean follows a CVC or consonant-vowel-consonant format. English can sometimes have 3 consonants to begin, be in the middle of, or even end a word, which Koreans have a lot of trouble with. To reconcile this, Koreans may often substitute the middle consonant for a vowel. An example of this is the word plight, P-L-I-G-H-T. Some Korean ELs may pronounce it as polite, P-O-L-I-T-E. This example shows just how simple pronunciations of words may cause a lot of stigmas or negative stereotypes about how Koreans pronounce English or speak English, which may get in the way of effectively learning the language and may prevent a comfortable environment in order for them to thrive. This slide is a continuation of the difficulties that Korean ELLs may face in second language acquisition in English. Differences in syntax play a huge role in how Koreans understand English grammar. It's very different because in English, we use a subject-verb-object word order that many native English speakers are used to because we grow up using it, have become accustomed to it, and study it in our basic grammar classes. Koreans, however, use a subject-object-verb sentence structure, which may cause a bit of confusion for Korean ELLs. In addition, the Korean language does not have any conjugations or inflections, so unlike in English, present tense verbs don't take on an S or change in any way. Korean ELs can often have difficulty with subject-verb agreement because it doesn't conjugate like English or other similar languages like Spanish, French, and the like. I would suggest to educators who have Korean ELs in their classroom to be more understanding and empathetic of the difficulties that their students may face and to try and reconcile the syntactic differences that exist between English and Koreans to somehow ease the stress that Korean ELLs may face.
So now we're going to be talking about the proxemics between South Korean students. So proxemics is basically the amount of space that people feel is necessary to put between themselves and others. And this is important to know because you might have South Korean students that they're used to different personal space than how the normal American educational system is. So greetings between male and female friends have clear personal distance level, excluding physical contact. They don't like physical contact with male and female friends. And Koreans, older Koreans, will touch children to show their warm affection. With similar genders and close friendships, there can be some touching. But, however, Koreans do not like to be touched by strangers. And how I like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, since there is a huge population density, especially in urban areas, contact with strangers is going to happen. So when there is personal space invaded, there tends not to be an apologetic response from people because they're kind of used to that in urban areas. And my advice is, if you are noticing a South Korean student being weird with distance, probably because they're just not comfortable with you yet, and they just need to be more comfortable with you. And also, gender does play a role. So if you have a female student, they are probably going to be, if you're a male and you have a female student, they're probably going to be a little bit more distant from you, and likewise the other way. So now we're going to be discussing the osculistics, which means how they have eye contact with you. So an important thing about osculistics is that Koreans tend to avoid eye contact with a person of a different age group or higher status, because if they were to have direct eye contact, it would be seen as impolite. So if you're teaching someone that is appearing not to really make eye contact, it's probably not because they're not, I mean, they could be shy, but in their culture, it's just impolite to make direct eye contact. However, I did find that during a friendly conversation, it can be okay to make full eye contact with the person you're talking to. And if someone was to make direct eye contact, it shows boldness. So that's something to look out for if you have any South Korean student. And I think if you were a teacher and you didn't really know this information, you could think that someone's like kind of avoiding or not trying to initiate things, but they're just used to not really looking at the teacher. So I think it would be useful to know that they're not trying to avoid you, they're just used to that.
So it's also important to be aware of the sort of cultural norms of social interactions for ELL students. So in South Korea, they really have an emphasis on showing politeness and respect when interacting with others. So they'll often speak in a softer voice, and they'll avoid things like loud laughter to show that respect and politeness. Laughter might also be used very deliberately in conversation. They often use it to express discomfort in a situation. So it might be important for educators to look out for those kinds of social cues to see if they can pick up on any discomfort in their South Korean ELL students. They also use pauses very deliberately in conversation. So a pause is usually used before they respond to something to indicate that they appreciate what the other person has said or asked, and that they respect them enough to really put a lot of thought into their response. So a pause doesn't mean that they're disengaged or that they're not paying attention. It usually just means that they're really thinking about how they're going to respond. So it's important to be aware of these things as an educator to understand how South Koreans communicate.
These are the questions we'd like you to think about and then answer in the discussion forum.
Question number 1. What would you do if you had a South Korean student appear shy and avoid making eye contact with you? Why do you think this is the case?
2. You see a native English speaker making fun of a South Korean student's accent. How would you intervene?
Number 3. If a student might miss classes for a holiday or religious event, how would a teacher best accommodate them?
Question 4. How can teachers help students adapt to the differences that the American educational schedule brings?